Hi. So when I started trying to explain what my DMX2Midi and Midi2DMX software did, I realized that that was going to be really hard without a whole load of background information on DMX. So I'm making this video basically just give you a quick primer on DMX and some of the basics you might need to know. So DMX is a way of controlling lights, and so we're going to have some kind of, originally we would have had some kind of lightning desk, and rather than running high power electrical voltage controlled signals, this is a digital way of connecting your desk to each of your lights. The signal is carried on a 5-pin XLR cable like this one. So this is a legit DMX cable. But at the sort of low to mid level, they realised that 2 of those pins aren't actually connected to anything. So instead, most of the DMX cables you're going to come across is going to use a 3-pin XLR, because 3-pin XLRs are cheaper. Now, this looks like a mic cable, but it's not a mic cable, and we know that because somewhere on it will have, I've written on it, professional DMX cable. DMX cables and XLR cables, XLR audio cables, look the same, apart from the fact it's got DMX written on it, but they're not the same. If you try and run audio down this, you're going to get interference. If you try and run DMX down a mic cable, you're going to get dropouts and signal errors. So keep them separate. So this is going to connect your lighting desk to your light. So on the back of each of our lights, we're going to have a DMX in. So we're going to run a cable from our lighting desk into the DMX in, and it will also have a DMX out. And we're going to run that cable to the next light. So if you've got a big lighting truss with 20 lights on, you just daisy chain each of those lights. Now, this DMX cable can carry 512 channels. So that originally would have controlled 512 lights. However, that was back when your lighting rig looked like this. Nowadays, your lightning rig probably looks more like this. The thing you'll notice is there's a lot less lights, but each of those lights can now change color, move, project different patterns. So whereas originally the system was designed that there would be 512 channels to control up to 512 lights, so that you'd literally dim, move a fader and dim each of those lights. On a modern lighting system, each light typically uses multiple channels. Okay. So on the back of my light, we can see I've got an option. This is D01, which tells me this is listening for channel 1. As this light has a red, a green, a blue, and a white channel, it's going to use 4 DMX channels. So this is set to DMX channels 1, 2, 3, and 4. This one is set to 5, so it's going to listen to 5, 6, 7, and 8. We typically allocate a separate block of channels to each light, and if you have a big complicated light, if you've got some kind of big pixel array, it's possible for a single light to be using dozens, potentially even hundreds of channels. Isn't unheard of. So as lighting rigs got bigger and the lights themselves got more complicated, you ran out of channels. 512 isn't enough to run a modern lighting rig. And so the first solution is simply, well, let's have 2 cables. Why not? Two cables, we can now have 1,024 channels of lighting information. We can now run twice as many lights. Or 4 cables. or 8 cables. And each of these cables is called a universe. So in DMX speak, a universe is a bank of 512 channels. Of course, now we're back in the situation we're trying to get away from. But we didn't want to have to run cables to every single light. But we're now running multiple DMX cables. So very quickly, lighting engineers sort of cottoned on to the fact that they didn't need to run a DMX cable. They could just use an Ethernet cable. And in fact, they could use all of the networking standards that we use with modern hubs and routers, and it would be cheap. And in fact, buildings would be rigged for it. So instead of having to run multiple DMX cables from your desk, you would run one Ethernet cable, and you could run that to your stage, and then we'd have a box like this, which is going to convert Ethernet back to real DMX. So obviously, in modern times, rather than a traditional lighting desk, we're probably going to have some kind of computer involved. If we're going to directly connect to old school DMX, we need some kind of interface, which is going to convert USB into DMX. This has 2 outputs because it can control 2 universes, 1024 channels. But if we're just running over Ethernet, we don't need any hardware at the computer end. We've already got a network interface on our computer. So when we run DMX over Ethernet, it uses a system called ArtNet. 5-10 years ago, ArtNet was big, expensive if you were running stadium lighting. Nowadays, you can get a simple ArtNet node, which is the name, an ArtNet to DMX converter, for about £50. So these are pretty cost effective, and they have the advantage that they're standard. One of the things you need to be really careful of, if you are buying a hardware interface, you need to make sure that your software running on your computer or your iPad can talk to that interface. Unlike MIDI, where there's a standard for MIDI interfaces and all MIDI interfaces work with all software, with DMX that's not the case. Different interfaces need to be supported by the software that you're buying. Whereas with ArtNet, it's a standard, there's no hardware involved at the computer end, so any ArtNet software can very easily talk to any ArtNet node that might be on your network.
Let's see what that looks like in practice. I've got my DMX software running on my iPad, and I've got that's talking ArtNet so it's going over Ethernet, this ArtNet node, which is then converting to regular DMX, which is talking to my 2 lights. So now I need to set up my ArtNet software. And the first thing I need to set up is I need to tell the software about my ArtNet node. So if I go into settings, one of the settings you'll find is protocol. Now you can use, this software supports ArtNet or SACN. We're going to just stick with ArtNet. SACN, similar, but ArtNet is what we're using. And we've got 2 options. Now, the easiest option is to just let this go, and this will work. We don't have to do any config on this, because what's going to happen is when it wants to send some data out, by default, it's going to send it to every device on the network, which is probably okay. If we're doing a show, we've probably got a dedicated network, and so that'll be okay. But it is going to send a lot of traffic, and it's going to clog up our network. So if we're trying to use our network for other things, if, for example, maybe we're trying to use that for mixing as well. So we've got a digital desk, and there's a guy with an iPad desperately moving faders around trying to fix feedback, and you're clogging it. So we can improve this a little bit. We can get a much better performance if we tell this software just to message it directly to my ArtNet node, because at the minute I've only got one ArtNet node. So if I've only got one ArtNet node, I can tell it that its IP address is 192.168.0.20. This is just like when you set up your home network. Your internet router at home will allocate IP addresses. This is called an IP address. Your computer's got one, your iPad's got one, and I've set the ArtNet node up to have the IP address of 192.168.0.20. So now this software is sending directly to this node and only this node, which is important if I'm running other things on the network that I don't invest. We also said that one of the things that we really like about ArtNet is we can carry multiple universes, but at any one point in time, this software is only going to drive one universe. So we need to so when I set up my node, I told it to listen for that it was controlling universe 0, and similarly I've set up universe 0 on the software. And subnet is just a way of grouping universes together. So now my software can talk, and it says, hey, ArtNet configuration updated. My software is now talking to my ArtNet. The next thing I need to do is I need to tell it about the lights that are on my DMX network. Now, if you've got fancy sort of £1,000 lights, they can do this automatically. But old school lights, we're going to have to do this ourselves. So I'm going to go into devices. We can see I've set up my two devices already. This one running on using addresses 1 to 4 because if you remember I programmed it with 1 on the back. This one I programmed with 5 on the back. If you're lucky, you've got a relatively modern light, it will have a little LED display on the back telling you the number. If not, you might have a series of switches that look a little bit like this, and we can program a specific number by moving these switches. This would be 9 would be the next available one. I can create another one. So I've told it what channels my device is going to use. I also need to tell it what each of those channels mean. So here I've got my custom device. If I go in and look, I've told it that this particular device uses the first 3 channels to control red, green and blue, and the 4th channel to use white. Of course, that gets combined with the base. This one's using 1, 2 and 3 for red, green, blue, and 4 for white. This is using 5, 6, 7 for red, green, blue, and 8 for white. The software is quite like to have a whole load of standard devices by big manufacturers built in. So if I'm using, say, an American DJ DOTS T-PAR system, we can see that uses 9 channels. A Boombox Effects 2 uses 19 channels. Fortunately, these are all pre-programmed for you in this particular software. Most software does have some kind of library. If it's not programmed, you can make your own. Your DMX light, when you bought it, hopefully came with some instructions, and hopefully you didn't lose them, because inside there's going to be a table which is going to tell you exactly what each of the channels does. Once you've told your ArtNet software how to find your network, which channels each of your lights are on, and what each of those channels mean, you can start to just play with them. So here I've got group 1, says this is controlling device 1, and when I click it I can change the brightness. If I go in, I can change the color. Here I've got a group that's controlling my other light, controlling light 2. This one controls both of them. And turn them on and off. Now, every lighting software is going to be different, but it calculates the brightness of each channel. In old school terms, in the Iron Maiden light show, it calculates the brightness of each of those pars and takes a block of 512 of them, sends them over the Ethernet of ArtNet to my ArtNet node. My ArtNet node converts that back into old school DMX, which goes over my DMX cable. Each of my lights receives those 512 blocks, picks out the, in this case, the 4 that are relevant to that light based on the address that we've sent, and then uses that to control its own light. Okay. So that's the basics of DMX. It's kind of complicated in that there's a lot of new terminology if you haven't used it before, but actually as a protocol it is much simpler than, say, MIDI. There are only, here's a block of 512 brightness values, and I'm going to send you a new version in a minute. Right? So hopefully I've covered everything, and hopefully that's given you sort of enough information on DMX that we can start to talk in the next video, talk about how my app DMX2Midi and conversely my other app Midi2DMX can start to fit into your ArtNet workflow. Thanks for watching.